What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, but today we are going to be discussing H.H. Holmes and the Murder Castle. I figured I must preface this story with the fact that up until about 10 years ago, I knew nothing about H.H. Holmes or his murder castle. He only came to my attention when I randomly, at some point, came across a book called Devil in the White City, Murder, Magic, and Madness at the Fair That Changed America by Eric Larson. And that book was published in 2003. So it was about 11 or 12 years before I had come across it. If I'm being honest, and I always do my best to be rigorously so, I didn't care that much for that book. I'm one of those people that needs to be able to picture everything that's happening in the book in my head as I read it, and that particular book made it nearly impossible for me to be able to do that. The way it was structured, it bounced back and forth. No shade on Eric Larson, it was still a ton of information, and I became enchanted almost instantly with H.H. Holmes, especially after I found out that in my favorite show, and the only one I watch religiously, and almost the only one I really care about watching at all, American Horror Story, based the season called Hotel on Holmes's murder castle, and the main character, played by Evan Peters, who is one of my most beloved actors, played James Patrick March, who was based directly on Holmes himself. I've been wanting to do a video on H.H. Holmes for years, but for one reason or another, I just wasn't able to get there mentally. However, he has been popping up randomly in everything I watch, read, and or in source material for things I write about for a while now, and I figured there's no time like the present. You all have asked me in the past to do a series on serial killers, and I feel like I'm finally ready to do that. What better way to begin than at the beginning with America's first serial killer? Being involved in the paranormal community as I am, and I'm sure it's the same for a lot of you who know from firsthand experience about such things, I've come to understand that there's a big difference between places that are merely creepy and somewhat haunted and places that are actually just downright evil in general. They take on a life of their own, and that life is evil. If you still think, after all the time I've spent discussing it with you all, or just from watching my videos, that a place can't be evil, maybe this won't be your video. Residual energy plays a huge role in most hauntings, and if we want to get into the mind of our serial killer friend here, we first need to understand his so-called murder castle and what it should mean to those of us who are extremely interested in things like this. In order for me to believe a place is evil in and of itself, or that it was evil because this one no longer stands, unfortunately, there need to be some strict criteria that are met. They can't just be the home of spirits or ghosts or even demons who roam its halls and stalk the walls within on a constant and consistent basis. That's not enough. That, in my opinion, is just your kind of average run-of-the-mill type of haunting. While scary and even downright terrifying sometimes, that's nowhere near what I'm bringing to you all today. Not even close. There needs to be pain, terror, torture, woe, strife, and so much death that long after the place itself has been torn down or otherwise is no more, the evil stays inside the residual energy and no one anywhere near or around it is ever safe again. One such place is Chicago's so-called murder castle. The building and its history are a dark spot on the city's reputation that will never be able to be erased or even smudged as long as people still talk about it so long after all of it already happened. One of our nation's first serial killers, and some say he was the first, built a hotel that resembled a castle. And in it, he lived out all of his demented, sick, dark, and twisted fantasies of death, horror, and terror. All the while, people that knew him knew something was wrong or a little amiss, but they had no idea the extent of that man's terror. I am speaking, of course, of H.H. Holmes and the infamous hotel/castle he built in Chicago, Illinois, that has led many to believe that because of what he did, the city itself, and possibly even the entire state, is forever doomed. In 1886, a man by the name of Henry Howard Holmes moved to the city of Chicago and took on a very humble position of employment at a local neighborhood drugstore. He was described as affable, charming, and very handsome, and before long he had made friends with everyone in the neighborhood and all of the patrons to the drugstore itself. He was a hard worker, and he took the somewhat menial tasks he was assigned very, very seriously. The little corner drugstore was owned by a woman named Elizabeth S. Holton. Her husband, Dr. E.S. Holton, was dying of cancer, and so it was left to her to take on the running of the pharmacy and all of the burdens that went along with it. She was getting up there in age, first of all, and back then it was extremely uncommon for a woman to own any type of business, let alone to be running everything on her own. It's unknown whether the good but ailing doctor was one of Holmes's victims, but he either died naturally due to his illness, which was cancer, or he was murdered by Holmes. And once that happened, our main man here charmed the newly widowed Mrs. Holton into letting him take over the day-to-day operations of the business under the pretense of him caring about her, having to work so hard when she should have been mourning her husband. As we go along here, guys, please understand that there are several different versions and variations to the story, and I chose to present to you guys what I could either fact-check myself or what came from sources I deem to be credible and normally used. So, some say Holmes charmed Mrs. Holton out of her panties as well, and there were rumors long before her husband's death that the two of them were indeed having an affair. Scandalous. All of it was rumors, though, and speculation. None of it was ever substantiated as far as I know. What is known for a fact is that eventually he was running the pharmacy, and before long after that, he had purchased the business from the overburdened and life-weary widow. Eventually, the widow would end up trying to sue Holmes for violating their payment agreement, as in he wasn't paying her anything at all and didn't even seem to be trying, despite the pharmacy pulling in a really large, good amount of sales. Eventually, this went on for long enough that Mrs. Holton just gave up and decided to leave town to go to California in order to retire in peace. Most people, even back then, figured Holmes had just murdered her in order to keep her quiet and so that the lawsuit against him would be dropped. But back then, people did this crazy thing of minding their own business. Besides, no one could prove he had done anything to her, and eventually everyone just kind of moved on and forgot about the situation. What most people weren't aware of at the time was that their beloved, handsome, and charming young pharmacist was not who they thought he was. His name was not Holmes at all, but Herman Webster Mudgett, born in New Hampshire in 1861. His interest in medicine and becoming a doctor started at a young age. While in his early teens or younger, some childhood friends, some say they were bullies, brought him into a doctor's office and showed him the skeletons. The friends or bullies, whatever they were, informed him that they came from inside of real dead bodies, the skeletons, in the hopes it would send the awkward young man running scared. However, it had the opposite effect, and Holmes became fascinated with death and cadavers then and there. And that's when he decided he wanted to be a doctor. Mudgett went to a few different medical schools before he finally settled on attending the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery. He worked in the medical lab, and it's thought that this is where he got his first taste of a life of crime. He would steal cadavers from the unit, burn or otherwise disfigure them, and then plant them somewhere that made it look like they were actual live human beings who had been killed somehow in some sort of accident. While this was definitely fraud, more importantly, it shows how little they had as far as forensics back then. He defrauded many insurance companies that way, and it's how he came to always have money. So he would be the beneficiary of these people. I guess he would I guess they were dead already, so he never knew them, so he would forge the paperwork. It'll come up soon. I'm going to get more into Holmes in the next one. This is basic murder castle, and I think I say that several times in here. Back then, though, money and status could get you really far, and he made this work very much to his advantage. Like I said, I'm going to focus more on the murder castle here than Holmes himself in this video because I have a lot more research to do in order to bring you a video on the man himself, but it is coming along with a bunch of others I plan to cover. So if it seems like I'm glossing over what some may deem to be major details pertinent to the story, bear with me and understand that that isn't at all the case. It's just going to come more into play in a lot more detail when we move on from the murder castle and get down to the man himself. The way I see it, the castle itself is an entity all its own and therefore deserves its own video. With all of that being said, let's move on. Herman got married in 1878 at the age of about 17 years old to a woman named Clara. He met Clara Levering while doing some odd jobs for her father. 2 years later, they married, the pair had a son together, but the honeymoon did not last long. Herman would be gone for very long stretches of time, and when he returned, he would tell his wife that he was learning to become a doctor so that they could live a wealthy life one day. Clara supported him at first, but she eventually got tired of being left alone all the time. I'll save the rest of those details for the next video, but I will say that one day, Herman Webster Mudgett just never returned home. He also committed bigotry, as he was married to at least 3 women all at the same time. After graduating from med school, he made the first of his many moves across the country and settled in a place called Moores Forks in New York. While he lived in New York, he came under suspicion of the authorities and some locals when a boy he was last known to have been with and who had last been seen with him by many witnesses ended up going missing. He wasn't ever charged with the crime, and there wasn't really any real substantial evidence that pointed to him having done anything to the child, but people did look at him differently after that. Holmes was a well-respected man at the time that this happened. The community respected him, but rather than stick around waiting for evidence to present itself or for the boy to be found, he packed his things and moved, once again, to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He immediately found work at a drugstore, and before long, suspicion was being aimed at him there too. Mainly, a young boy overdosed and died after taking medication he had gotten from the store Mudgett was working at. I think he was the one who mixed the medications, but I can't be sure. And once again, rather than wait for the police or any evidence to surface about his innocence or otherwise, he picked up again and moved to another big city. This time, it was Chicago, Illinois. He changed his name and his entire identity once he was there. He planned on being more important than he actually was, and successfully did both of those things right when he arrived. Changed his identity and was successful. This brings us full circle for him working at the Holtons pharmacy. He was successful and very well liked, and even those who thought something was off about him had absolutely no idea what his history really was or what he was really like deep down on the inside and behind his charming and handsome veneer. He almost immediately went right back into being shady and manipulating people, and it's also at this point when he found himself another woman to marry. Her name was Marta Belknap, and she wasn't originally from Chicago either. The blue-eyed, sexy young woman had met Holmes years before while he was spending some time in Minneapolis. He wrote to her and probably spun a bunch of lies, asking her to marry him and move away from her family and come to Chicago. She figured the life of a rich doctor in the big city of Chicago would be far more glamorous than the one that she had been living when his letter arrived, and she immediately accepted his proposal and offer. He and Marta moved to what's called the Englewood section of Chicago, and that's when he bought a pharmacy on 63rd and Wallace, directly across the street from where he would later build his infamous murder castle. The two married in 1887, and she had no idea that he was already married to Clara Loverling or that he had ever been married at all. She also didn't know he had a son, of course. At first, everything went well for the two, and they got along really well. However, it wouldn't take long for the newly pregnant Marta to notice the endless revolving door of young and attractive women who seemed to be only frequenting the pharmacy to get a glimpse of and to flirt with her handsome, young, successful, rich husband. She became very possessive of Holmes after that, and of course, that just wouldn't do. It wouldn't do at all. He started to see her right away as some kind of obstacle in his way of bettering himself, and of course of being able to have dalliances with the random young women who he saw as now far more attractive than his pregnant, boring wife. He eventually forced her to work upstairs in the apartment they shared and to work the books so she would be out of his way while he was working and so she wouldn't know what he was up to. He stayed married to her though, and they did have a little daughter named Lucy. He made sure that both mother and child were kept out of the way and out of sight most, if not all, of the time. Marta became increasingly angry and depressed, and she wrote about it all and often to her parents at home, still in Minneapolis. They thought Holmes was questionable from the very beginning because, despite him having made many short trips there in order to court their daughter, they found his courting style brash and unconventional for the times. He explained it away by saying that it was basically the way things are done in Chicago. Eventually, they tired of hearing how terrible their daughter's life had turned out with a man they never really trusted to begin with, and they moved themselves to their own home in Wilmette, Illinois. Marta moved in with them and brought Lucy with her. Her husband visits them sometimes, but really not that often, and he explains his very long absences on his busy work schedule and career. Old habits truly do die hard, I guess. Despite all of this that was happening in his personal life and his obvious narcissistic, psychopathic, and manipulative ways, he managed to keep his reputation intact, and in fact, he became even more well-liked and successful, all the while putting his poor second and unknowing wife and her family, not to mention his own daughter, through all of this. And don't even get me started on his first child or that child's mother, poor innocent victim Clara. Holmes became so successful around this time, from 1887 and in the years leading up to the Chicago World Fair in 1893, he bought a lot across the street from the drugstore and began having a massive 3-story building constructed that he planned on turning into a hotel. Even the undertaking and construction of the hotel could lead us deep into the demented mind of this man. It was all extremely unusual. He frequently would change the architects, contractors, and workers, and when anyone would ask questions or try to collect money for their work, they were fired and replaced immediately. Some say he built the hotel knowing that the World's Fair was coming, and I tend to believe that's true. I mean, after all, he knew there would be plenty of business for the brand new hotel, if nothing else. Holmes designed the building himself, but the way he designed it, with so many rooms that made no sense, secret areas, trapdoors, and other really bizarre oddities, he needed to make sure he didn't come under any suspicion, and that's one of the main reasons he went through so many work crews as well. Also, the plans that he gave to the city about what he was building, like they had to be approved, they were not the actual plans for the hotel. He acquired many, many debts, but it didn't matter to him because he never planned on paying any of them anyway. Once he had spurned one person or company, he simply found another who wasn't aware of the way that he did business. I remember originally thinking when I first read this that word must not have traveled very fast in those days or in that area, but then it said that he would pretend to be someone other than himself when the debtors who had never seen him before came around looking for their money, and when the person was aware that they were speaking with Holmes, the ones who had met him before, he was so good at schmoozing and manipulating people, he often made them feel bad or like something was wrong with them for not trusting him to eventually pay them in the first place. A lot of the times the contractors and stuff were from out of town, so they weren't familiar with who he was, so he would pretend to be an innocent bystander, like, oh, H.H. Holmes? Yeah, I haven't seen him in a while, and nobody knew, no one was the wiser. On one of his very infrequent visits to Wilmette to visit Marta and Lucy, he convinced her great uncle to lend him $2,500 that he said he needed in order to build he and his wife a home of their own for them and their daughter. Once he ran through that money, he forged the uncle's signature and got himself another $2,500 loan. Can we just stop for a minute and understand that $2,500 back then is equal to approximately a little over $80,000 in today's money American? Wow. That's about $160,000 to $170,000, half of which he basically fraudulently stole. Not basically, he did. He brazenly still continued to visit Marta and the uncle he robbed and actually convinced the elderly man, the same guy he stole from, to go with him to Chicago to see the site of the fair and also the building he was having constructed. After some convincing, the uncle begrudgingly agreed to go to Chicago with Holmes. He stayed for one night in one of the finished rooms at Holmes's new hotel, but he ended up staying awake the entire night because he said someone kept trying to break into his room. The next day, Belknap found out that Holmes had forged his name on that huge second loan, and he was furious, of course. However, in typical H.H. Holmes fashion, he pled for the old man's sympathy. He begged for his forgiveness and that he didn't tell Marta or anyone else what he had done. It was at that point where it said he decided he must have a large kiln in the hotel. He already had another one of his businesses, a glassworks operation, in a space on the first floor of the hotel that was out of sight. He passed off the need for a kiln by saying he needed it for the glassworking and by explaining to the people he commissioned to build it for him that the hotter the kiln, the easier it would be for him to be able to bend glass with it. Of course, there's a lot more to this story, but let's talk about when the hotel was finally completed in 1891. Holmes started hiring employees to work there, but he made an odd request to anyone before he hired them. They all had to have life insurance policies with him as the benefactor. It was a demand, and anyone who refused, he would send packing and simply just not hire. Honestly, although this seems extremely sus to us now, and it may have been a little bit of a weird thing back then, it wasn't enough at the time. I don't understand why, but it wasn't, for people to become suspicious of him at all, and he continued with business as usual, and he actually got people to do this. The World's Fair came and went, but the hotel part of the building was never actually open to the public because of all the controversy over all of the money Holmes owed everyone who had helped him build the place. The contractors, the architects, everybody, down to the people who gave him the furniture on credit. I remember reading the book and I was stunned at how this dude did business. Like, he was good. And he was really good looking. He never paid a single debt, and it was all catching up to him. Back then, though, a lot of this, at least according to what I remember from the book, was a case of he said, and therefore, at least for some or most of it, there wasn't any recourse against him, and no one can prove that he actually hadn't paid them, mostly. Despite the hotel not being open to the public, the bottom storefront section of the building was a great success and brought in tons of business. This is right around the time when a man named Ned Connor, his wife Julia, and their daughter Pearl moved into Holmes's building in order for Ned to run the jewelry counter, which was, I guess, in the pharmacy. They all got along brilliantly until Ned, who already thought Holmes was a little weird, decided he didn't appreciate the attention Holmes unabashedly gave to not only his daughter, but his wife as well. Things got even stranger for Ned when Holmes asked him to help him out by going into one of the hotel's vaults to make sure it was soundproof. The city of Chicago was seeing people coming and going and disappearing at an alarming rate at that point. Young women were drawn to the big city with promises of freedom, excitement, and even secretarial work, and young men were drawn for freedom and work as well. When people would go missing back then from places like that, there was no way to really figure it out or track them down because they were only ever traveling or passing through. They were visiting, so here one minute and gone the next. It wasn't like they had GPS or cell phones to track them. It was writing letters and taking trains. There were a lot more people than normal there around this time, though, because the World's Fair had brought a lot of people in who stayed as well. Neither the people who knew him or the police ever suspected H.H. Holmes was an indiscriminate murderer of the most foul and dreadful type. Guys, I promise, I will get back to the life of H.H. Holmes, the insanity of his personal life, but I promised you all a video about the murder castle for part 1, so now let's discuss how he got caught. The people who knew Holmes best, or at least thought they did, thought of him as nothing more than a gloriously wealthy playboy and sort of a scamp of a man. Many of them secretly disliked him as he took on yet another wife and openly had affairs with many other women right out in the open at the same time. However, as I said previously, they really didn't think of him as anything more than those types of things. He was a jerk. He was an a-hole. The idea of duality hadn't yet hit this country, and I think it was only starting to, or just had, overseas with the murders of Jack the Ripper. I will mention here that some people believe that H.H. Holmes and Jack the Ripper are one and the same. While I've come across and have been presented with some rather compelling evidence that falls right in line with that actually being the case, I'm afraid at the end of the day, I'm simply not convinced. While the World's Fair was happening all around them, people were oblivious to the fact that Holmes and an accomplice/semi-friend, a man named Benjamin Pitezel, were traveling the country murdering people and committing insurance frauds with the dead bodies every chance they got. No suspicion was raised when he would leave Chicago in order to do any of those things either. Not all of his schemes were successful. After all, he was only human, and there's only so much evil one human man can do. And Holmes eventually ended up in jail for one of the scams he unsuccessfully tried to pull off. After that, he decided to fake his own death in order to escape all of the BS surrounding all of the money he owed for the hotel to so many people, some of whom had now gone to the authorities about all of it. Holmes decided to fake his own death, and to make a long story short, because I'm going to get into the details later on, he asked his regular accomplice and old friend, Benjamin Pitezel, to help him out. This story gets so incredibly convoluted. If you don't know it, just wait for part 2. Apparently, the word scam escaped Holmes's grasp because he simply made sure that Benjamin Pitezel died and then tried to pretend to be him. As the beneficiary for H.H. Holmes on all of his documentation, Holmes then escaped with the money for his own life insurance. However, Pitezel's family knew Holmes and knew what he looked like, as did everyone he otherwise knew in Chicago, and he couldn't remain pretending to not be himself. He murdered Pitezel while out on the road and then returned to Chicago. Pitezel was reported as missing, and this is what would eventually lead in a series of more heartbreaking and gruesome tragic murders of so many people, including children, to his eventual capture and confession. By this time, police already were looking for Holmes because he had a warrant out for him for insurance fraud, but they began to suspect him of murder once they put 2 and 2 together and realized his friend, traveling companion, and usual accomplice, who had last been seen and otherwise known to be with him, was now a missing person. Holmes did what he always did, and when the heat got to be too much, he took off for smoother shores. He was tracked down and arrested in Boston, and once you hear all of the details of that mess, you're going to be shocked down to your socks. I will tell you that much at least right now. A disgruntled former accomplice had ratted him out because he hadn't paid the accomplice for being an accomplice, and he was arrested on November 17th, 1894. As the police dug deeper, they found that not only was Benjamin Pitezel dead, but so were 3 out of 5 of his young children, all of whom had last been known to be in the care of Holmes, or at the very least last seen with him, depending on the source. He had been carrying out an elaborate scheme and pretending to be Benjamin in letters to his wife until it all got out of hand and he was sloppy and he just couldn't keep up with it all anymore. That's just to sum it up. Figuring he could possibly and was likely to be linked to more unsolved disappearances, the police began to search the hotel. That's when it was all finally revealed and came unraveled at the seams for our buddy Herman. A lot of the women who were missing, regardless of where they were from, had been known to work at one time or another at Holmes's store, or to have otherwise known and or spent time with him and or had affairs with him. As soon as the authorities started searching the hotel, they knew something was very wrong. There were stairs and stairways that led to nowhere and doors that either opened to nowhere or doors that opened to brick walls. The floor plan was described as complicated and labyrinthine and seemed to be made with the sole purpose of confusing people. There were peepholes in walls everywhere, along with secret trap and aberrant doors everywhere you turned. The anomalous holes were later found to have been for the purpose of inserting hoses in order to pump poisonous and noxious gases and fumes into other rooms and spaces all throughout the building. Many of the rooms had alarms in them, were soundproofed, or otherwise had trap doors that led down into the basement. None of it made any sense at first, but once the authorities made their way down into the bowels of the hotel, down into the basement, the horror and macabreness of it all would become startlingly crystal clear. One of the first things they found down in the murky depths of the dark and creepy basement was a pile of bones, animal and human mixed. The bones would later be found to have come from children and small animals. There were other bone fragments, an acid vat that held the sole purpose of dissolving human remains and presumably animal remains as well. There was a huge stove down there that was used for the cremation of bodies, where inside of the huge pile of ashes was found a woman's gold chain, some metal buttons, and a watch. There were giant vats of chemicals that were also thought to have been used for the purpose of dissolving remains too, and a dissecting table that had piles and piles of bloodied women's clothing lying right on top of it, right out in the open. Right next to the table and all along the wall, there were tools for buy and dissection. According to some accounts, but this is still and most likely will always remain unconfirmed, there were various other torture devices that were likened to something straight out of a medieval dungeon. By all accounts, it was a murderer's playground and a veritable what's what of macabre and grotesque items used for the sole purpose of torturing and killing human beings with the most possible pain afflicted to the victims. It was now much more than just suspicion, and the police knew what Holmes had been up to all along, or at least somewhat, because there was no way a normal person would ever be able to understand the true motives or the intensity of what he was doing in that hotel. The alarms in the room turned out to be rigged so that they would go off in his own room, and the peepholes were there for him to be able to surreptitiously watch his chosen guests and keep an eye on their every movement. All of the secret doors allowed him to move around the entire hotel within the walls without anyone seeing him or knowing he was there at all. Honestly, if I'm telling the truth, it was a bit genius. Just saying. Holmes would administer the gases into the chosen guest rooms, and once they were knocked out and unconscious, none of which they would ever be expecting, he could go and grab them without them putting up a fight. Again, while using all of the secret passageways and trapdoors so no one saw him carrying unconscious bodies from one place to another, and so he could do what he wanted with them for as long as he wanted to do it. Nobody knew. Nobody understood. They all saw the little weirdo things in the hotel, but whose mind immediately goes to that, especially in the late 1800s? Then he would toss them down one of the hidden chutes where they would fall into the basement. Sometimes they would fall directly into the acid vats, and other times they would land down there and he would cremate them. Something he had done his whole murderous adult career was to kill people, and after getting everything off of the bones, he would then bleach the bones and sell the skeletons to the medical community as teaching tools or whatever the hell they used real human skeletons for back in those days. You know, those dangly skeletons we have now that are plastic? They used real ones, and grave robbing was a big thing back then. So that's most likely one of the reasons why he was de-skinning some of the bodies and cremating others. He was also chopping them up after torturing some of them while they were still alive and then dissolving them in the acid or, again, cremating them. This was one extremely sick man, in my opinion, allegedly. Authorities firmly believed that the non-intuitive layout and random doors to nowhere, etc., were all done purposely in an effort to thwart any attempt at escape by his victims. The hotel never officially opened, but Holmes did have guests every once in a while and rented out rooms to his friends and people that worked for him in the stores at the bottom level. He also had a bunch of his mistresses staying there, most likely more than one at a time, because the place was so massive, so huge, and so confusing, it was almost guaranteed they would never run into or otherwise meet or see one another. It's unknown how many people Holmes actually killed in this death motel, but the remains show it was way more than just a few. He wasn't stretching his serial killer legs by any means and was a full-fledged psycho killer by the time he was caught. In the end, not a single full human body or corpse was found, and the bones could have come from literally anywhere, especially back in a time where grave robbing meant food on the table and people could change their identities simply by speaking a name out loud into the air. He had worked with cadavers before in med school, and so he kind of just explains it all away, or at least tried to, by saying they were cadavers of the already deceased he was practicing medicine or medical procedures on. How believable this would have been is up for debate, though. While the evidence they had collected was gruesome, macabre, and unbelievable, there was actually nothing concrete that would help the authorities build a solid case against him. They figured out what he had been doing, but weren't going to be able to prove any of it without him confessing. There was no proof he had murdered anyone, and so he wasn't charged with anything pertaining to the evidence collected at the hotel. The hotel, and I still don't really know what he was planning on naming it, and I don't think anyone really does, but I am going to look into that for part 2. It just came to be known as the Murder Castle thanks to the sensationalization of what had been discovered there by the news media. Police and news media worked hand in hand back then, so whatever they found, the news media, the local newspaper, I guess, knew about it right away. Some things never change, though, am I right? Also, Holmes himself insisted he was innocent and vehemently denied ever having committed murder in his entire life. He was indignant at the implications. The trial, which we'll cover more in depth in the next video, was strange and highly bizarre to say the least. It was also very highly publicized. He would only be found guilty, at least officially, of the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. Though he was implicated greatly in the murders of Pitezel's 3 children as well, there simply was not enough evidence to say that he had actually done anything to them. However, in the wake of the trial, something inside of H.H. Holmes seems to have snapped, and after adamantly denying all charges against him and pleading his innocence to the public and the courts throughout the entirety of the trial, he started to undergo some kind of change. He changed his tune and admitted to committing a whopping 27 murders in addition to the murder of Benjamin Pitezel, and confessed to attempting another 6 murders. He made claims about Satan and demons influencing him and blamed those alleged influences for all of the horrific and horrible crimes he committed. The devil made me do it. One of his most famous quotes from when he was incarcerated, and there were more than a few because he incessantly wrote the whole time he was awaiting execution, went like this, quote, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing. I was born with the evil one standing as my sponsor beside the bed where I was ushered into the world, and he has been with me since," end quote. Obviously, this was a very sensational story and garnered attention all over the country and possibly internationally too. America would no longer be in the shadows as far as an infamous and terrifying serial killer like Jack the Ripper in England. We can now boast our very own. The news stories, of course, were constantly and consistently exaggerated so that the news people could sell more papers, and the pulp and tabloid-style papers of the day had Holmes boasting of at least 200 murders. It really doesn't matter what he confessed to or how many murders anyone thinks that he had committed, because at the end of the day, he was only ever convicted of one murder, the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. Back then, one murder was all someone needed to be sentenced to death. He was executed by hanging on May 7th, 1896. The execution was, of course, a public spectacle and made even more spectacular by the fact that it ended up being a botched execution. Holmes dangled on the rope, alive and strangling to death for almost 20 minutes while a shocked and horrified crowd of onlookers stood and watched. Some even cheered. Holmes requested that his body be encased in concrete because he was worried that grave robbers would steal it. Wow, the irony, huh, Herman? Unbelievably, or maybe not, the authorities carried out the final request and his body was sealed up in a big old slab of concrete in order to prevent the theft and desecration of it. If only his victims had been given the same thoughtfulness and consideration, right? After his execution and concrete burial, there seemed to be an inordinate number of deaths, accidents, and tragic mishaps that happened to people in places known to be associated with Holmes. This included people who had helped him while he was locked up and awaiting his execution. The first in a long line of these was the coroner who had testified against him not long after he had been put to death, developed blood poisoning under unknown and still mysterious circumstances, and died because of it. In 1895, a mysterious fire we still don't know the cause of burned the hotel to the ground. I mourn it. After the fire, there were numerous deaths in a very rapid succession of people linked to Holmes in some way or another. Another coroner involved in the case and the judge who had ultimately sentenced him to death both came down with sudden and mysterious illnesses that killed them. The warden of the prison Holmes was kept in took his own life randomly and suddenly with no explanation or note either. The father of one of Holmes's alleged victims and the priest who read him his last rites died strangely and inexplicably. The foreman of the trial jury died in what looked like a freak accident when electrical wires suddenly came loose and fell upon him, thoroughly electrocuting him to death. This all led many people to believe that he had left some sort of curse behind him when he went to his grave. Some speculated it was done as he strangled there while people cheered and watched with glee for a full 20 minutes, and no one tried to help him or possibly correct it. I don't think there's a way. I think when an execution like that, especially with hanging, is botched, what can you really do? Things, I don't want to get into detail, but a friend of mine took his own life this way, and things happen as soon as you make the first move to do that. So even if they, it just would have been a mess. Look, I'm not saying that helping at that point would have been possible, and I know a lot of people will disagree with this, but hear me out. Perhaps had anyone shown a modicum of common decency and common humanity to the man as he suffered in front of them like that, they wouldn't have had to worry about such things as dark curses. I know people will say he didn't show any of that to his victims, and they would be right, but he was a sick and twisted serial killer. Surely, we can hold ourselves to a higher standard in our own humanity than someone like H.H. Holmes. But that's just my thought on the curse aspect of it all. I obviously don't know. The curse didn't end there, though, and one of the insurance companies who failed to help him fake his own death had their office burned to the ground somewhat mysteriously as well. There were even more strange deaths that I could list here in later years as well. The men who pointed the finger at Holmes and ratted him out were all pardoned for their own crimes, but one of them, the main one who did most of the ratting, was shot and killed in a violent shootout with police of all people in Chicago in 1909. In 1914, the caretaker of the hotel, who by the way had been complaining for years at that point about having strange and terrifying hallucinations of some sort in the hotel while watching over the grounds and property, took his own life as well. Whether or not this was all due to an actual curse or just a long and deadly series of extremely unlikely coincidences remains unknown, but it's all creepy AF, that's for damn sure. Despite the building having burned to the ground, there are still strange screams heard all throughout the night where it once stood. Shadowy figures are often seen by neighbors of the charred plot of land both back then and still today, roaming and lurking around where the massive structure of torture once stood. Animals, it was said, before anything was built there after it burned down, avoided it like the plague. Dogs specifically wouldn't go anywhere near it and would moan and whine as though frightened whenever they would even walk past it. A post office was built on the property in 1939, and it's said to be extremely haunted still to this day. The postal workers who are employed at the Englewood Branch Post Office in Chicago report all kinds of freakish and terrifying paranormal and supernatural activity. These reports include, but aren't limited to, anomalous noises, roaming cold spots, those same shadow beings, shadow entities, shadow people, roving all around and over the building at all hours of the day and night, objects moving on their own or going missing altogether with no explanation, and the ghost of H.H. Holmes himself, though he's almost only ever seen in the basement of the building. The basement is the only part of the building that survived the fire and is the original one where Holmes carried out all of the atrocities against his victims and their remains in the first place. This is not a shock or in any way a surprise, and honestly, it was rather predictable when I first read about it, that there would be shadow beings and that Holmes himself would be in the only original part of the building. Why did they keep that basement? Of course, aside from the rumors of curses and speculation of the hauntings, there are many, many conspiracy theories surrounding Holmes and his murders. There was a long-standing theory that he never died and was able to go on killing and murdering innocent victims well into his twilight years. In 2007, that one was put to rest when his body was taken out of the concrete, remarkably intact along with his clothes and other things, and the DNA was tested and concluded to be definitively H.H. Holmes. He had been executed on May 7, 1896, and the body they buried was his. The remarkable and macabre story of America's first serial killer, or at least the first well-known, Henry Howard or H.H. Holmes, Herman Webster Mudgett, the American Ripper, whatever you want to call him, still endures. He achieved an almost legendary status as far as killers go, but from what I understand, it wasn't until that book I mentioned in the beginning that the entire nation started to become somewhat enchanted with him and mesmerized by his story. We have no idea, nobody does, how many people he actually killed, and can only and ever will be able to take a guess. I hate that the castle burned down, though I have little doubt that it wasn't an accidental fire. The history in that place and the stories, the spirits there, and probably the very walls that held it together could have told us have gone completely to waste now, literally up in smoke. There won't ever be a paranormal investigation into the original murder castle, but just as with the Titanic, I propose, you heard it here first, a museum in its honor, and in the honor not of the man who committed the unspeakable acts, but to his victims. And I guarantee you, should that ever happen, whether on the same grounds and in the exact same spot or halfway across the world, those victims and those walls will surface there, and they will speak and they will tell their story to the right people. Herman himself will too. I know it for a fact. Until then, we are left with this. I'll be delving more into detail with the rest of his strange life and convoluted plots and murders in part 2. Let me know what you think about this, and let me know what you think about a part 2. Until then, that's all I have for you today, guys. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the content, if you enjoyed hanging out with me and each other in the premiere. If you just want to see me smile, spread the love by sharing this video. Please hit that like button, subscribe, make sure your notifications are put to all right? Please check out the description box for some important links, how to purchase my books, Missing the Faith Theory, Encounters with Evil, 101 True and Terrifying Stories, and Shadow Entities, Sleep Paralysis, and Beyond, Kindle or paperback through Amazon, links in the description box. If you would like an autographed copy or for anything else, email me at GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. Ways to donate through the channel: PayPal, Patreon, Cash App, PayPal, Cash App. If you join my Patreon for $20 a month or more, you will get a personal intuitive oracle reading every single month as a thank you from me. Your donations are the only thing that keep this channel going, paying for StreamYard, paying for decks, paying for backgrounds, even though this one, I know I have to get a new one. You guys know the drill. This is how I make a living, so it is what it is. On Wednesday nights, check out me and Ghost Dragon ZW as I pull one random card from one random deck and give you a weekly oracle reading. I read intuitively with spirit from source. It usually starts at around 7:15 p.m. Eastern time, and we just go until we have no one else to read for. It is an amazing time. It is the best people on YouTube in the chat. I am so proud of that chat. On Thursday nights from 8 p.m. till whenever we go to again, it's myself, Ghost Dragon ZW, and Lara, Miss Paranormal Pixie, and you will find us chillaxing and chatting. We just kind of talk about whatever the chat wants. Every Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern time, or at least that's what I'm aiming for, you will get a pre-recorded video on my channel, just like this one. That's what this is. But I premiere it so you all can talk and I can stop in. Ghost Dragon stops in a lot. Every other Monday, not the Monday with this video, but every other Monday, Ghost Dragons and I at noon Eastern time try to have a guest, and if not, we kind of just hang out. And again, we just chill, we just talk about our week, our weekends, whatevs. It is what it is. Guys, please consider donating to the channel, purchasing a spiritual helper box, manifestation and intention spray, a personal one-on-one spiritual session with me. I know that sounds very vague, and you need to email me to get information about that. I do have a store. I just don't have a website yet. I sell things. I handcraft things. I homemade things, and I help people become more spiritually aligned and in tune. With all that being said, be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything. Be kind to yourselves too, and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. You're amazing. You can do it. You are co-creator of the universe. You create your own reality. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't do something. You're beautiful. You're amazing. I believe in you. Always go in grace. Smile at a stranger, and I'll see you guys next time.